This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the Marder, a German post-war infantry fighting vehicle, really an armoured personnel carrier for keeping soldiers in the back to keep up with fast tanks like the Leopard in that Cold War period.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
Now, the German military, we've already talked about with the Jagdkanone, the fact that the German military, when they were reformed, the West German Army, the Bundeswehr from 1955 onward, initially they're using equipment supplied by other armies. They start programs to build their own equipment to their own specifications. And with things like the Jagdkanone, they were looking at the end of the 1950s to build a series of vehicles with perhaps a common hull, commonality of parts, etc. Now, as part of that family, not all of them, in fact very few, actually built to this idea of a family, but they're looking for an infantry fighting vehicle for taking those soldiers in the mechanised battle groups to keep up with the tanks. And that leads in January of 1960 to the German military issuing a specification asking for designs and prototype vehicles for a new vehicle, and that is what becomes this vehicle, the Marder. We often sometimes call this Marder 1 because there was plans for a Marder 2. In fact, the Marder 2 never actually gets built. So early days, this is just called Marder, obviously, just like Leopard was Leopard until another variant comes along, and then we call it Leopard 1. Now, the Marder program, what they do, they go to two major industrial conglomerates that come together to put forward proposals for this vehicle. One of those is led by a group that's called Rheinstahl, and within that industrial group is a famous World War II armoured personnel manufacturer, Hanomag. And on the other side, there's a conglomerate that also includes Henschel, again, another World War II famous name, Henschel, and a Swiss manufacturer, Mowag. Now, what starts by happening is there's a series of prototype vehicles and test vehicles that are put together in the 1960s that come out and that are basically evaluated, and then a further series are put together. Three main sets of prototypes and test vehicles during the 1960s. So just taking you through those ones, at the beginning, the very first set of prototype vehicles are put together. Three of them are put together from Hanomag, two from Henschel and two from Mowag. That is then followed up by a second set of vehicles in 1961 to 1963. There's four vehicles from Hanomag, only one from Henschel and three more from Mowag. And then in the mid-1960s, there's a kind of hiatus for a while as the efforts of the designers and the factories actually concentrate on getting the Jagdkanone into production before in 1966 the German military sort of finalised their requirements for this vehicle, and that leads to a third set of prototype vehicles that are actually built later on, 10 from 1967 onwards, 10 from Hanomag, 4 from Henschel and 3 from Mowag. And that leads in turn to 10 pre-production vehicles that are being used, that are built from 1967 to 1968, troop trials 1968-69 for the German military, and that finally leads to an order of over about 2,000 of these vehicles, with Rheinstahl being the overall parent body. And they actually set up two production lines, one by MAK in Kiel and one at Kassel. And that really gets production going. The first vehicles are properly handed over to the German military for use in about May of 1971. So production continues until 1975. The factory line keeps going because they're actually using this same Marder hull for the Roland anti-aircraft system that's put on there, so that keeps going for some time longer. But over 2,000 of the Marders are built. Now, this vehicle that's actually next to me at the moment is one of those third production batch vehicles. So it's a pre-production vehicle. It's not actually complete, or it doesn't have the same configuration as those that went into service with the German military. And we'll look in a moment at the fact that the Marder in its service life has had a series of major upgrades, which really has changed how it looked from those very first early Marders that went into service. So what do you get when you get an early Marder? So as you look at the vehicle, it's got this long angular front body. That contains the engine on the front there, which is an MTU 6-cylinder diesel engine. And that diesel gives you just under about 600 horsepower. So it's a powerful engine in this vehicle because, again, they need this vehicle to have that power, to have that speed, so it could get up to about 47 miles an hour to keep up with things like the Leopard 1 tank. So that idea of that mobile mechanised infantry, there's no point having it if it can't keep up with your main battle tanks. And Leopard, as we all know, is a very mobile and very fast vehicle. So the engine's connected to a Renk gearbox. You've got about 4 reverse, 4 forward gears because, again, they want to be getting out of the situation quickly once they've deposited the infantry. And that power goes to the front where you can see the drive sprocket. It's got deal track, rubber padded tracks because, again, at this period, still to this day, German roads, you don't want to be ripping up the roads all the time with aggressive, just bare metal track. So deal double pin track there. And you've got 6 double rubber-coated road wheels down the sides here. Only the 2 middle ones don't have a hydraulic buffer on them. It's actually torsion bar suspension going through the system. But again, you've got this shock absorber system you can see on the outer 2. The inner 2 don't have them on the sides there. Idle wheel at the back and 3 return rollers along the top there. Now the driver sits at the front, he's on the far side, he's on the left side as he's facing forward. He looks forward, but behind him, and again we're back to the role of the vehicle, this is an infantry carrying vehicle, so behind him would often sit the section commander. And the early Marders, they had their own hatch, a simple hatch that would go behind the driver, so for a quick and easy communication. And in the back of the vehicle, that's where the section of infantry was carried. Initially, in the early Marders, 6 infantry on seats that run down the middle of the vehicle and they face outwards. Now, the very early Marders, what they do is they put this one on this pre-production vehicle, hasn't got them, but they actually put on each side 2 gun ports. So the infantry inside could actually use their weapons from inside the vehicle, firing out whilst the vehicles, they're still closed down. Now, in the back there, you can convert, and again, it's part of this peculiarly complex story. Different parts of the vehicle really have different pedigrees. Mowag did the seating system, and Mowag also designed that original seating system, so actually it collapses, and you can actually have 4 infantry in the back having a kip on those seats because they could collapse down. So again, that idea of looking after crew comfort, making sure your crew are going to be fit and able, for the fight when they're actually needed. At the rear is the door that actually flops down backwards. That door is where obviously the infantry exit, but initially again they give 2 hatches on the back. That was later changed in one of the upgrades to 3 hatches on the roof for the infantry, different arrangements there. So again, in early shots of the Marder, you'll see the infantry with their heads out the top there. Again, potentially they could have fired from those positions. That wasn't really the intention, but it certainly gives them battlefield visibility as well as periscopes on the back so they can actually have a look around the place.
The Tank Museum is a registered charity, and every purchase you make from our online shop directly supports our work. We ship worldwide, and if you subscribe to our email list, we'll give you 10% off your next order. When you finish this video, go to tankmuseumshop.org and you'll find something you never knew you needed.
Driver, by the way, you can see he's got 3 periscopes on the front. Middle one could be removed so they can put a night vision periscope in there for driving and fighting at night as well. On the top here, that's where you'd also have 2 other crew members in the turret. You've got a commander and a gunner, and they're equipped there on this design of this particular turret with a 20mm Rheinmetall gun. It's called the Mark 20mm gun, and that could fire armour-piercing or high explosive, relatively small caliber 20mm, but again with good high velocity behind. The aim was really at this period is they're trying to keep comparisons going. It's got to be able to potentially defeat the opposition vehicle of this period, which would have been BMP-1. That's what comes into play. And later, they actually up armour on this vehicle because they're worried about the BMP-2 having a 30mm cannon. The proof armour protection on this vehicle was originally designed to face up to 20mm fire coming from the front. So that turret there holding the 20mm cannon, it's got an impressive angle. It can go up to about 65 degrees from the horizontal, going 65 degrees up. That means it can be used for anti-aircraft work, and that was again back to this period of the Cold War. The West was very conscious of Soviet air power. How are we going to keep Soviet bombers, Soviet fighters away from the tanks and the defensive positions there? So it can actually go up plus 65 or minus 17 degrees actually in its depression angle. They carry inside the vehicle, one of the improvements they made on later models of this is because of the feed system. The gun in essence is outside the main turret. The feed system going into that gun, the empty brass shell cases are actually immediately ejected away from the turret, and you'll be able to see that in footage as they're flying out when the gun actually starts firing. You can see the periscopic arrangements there. They had a ×2, ×6 sight for the commander. And again, so those two figures are in that turret, and the idea again for that gun is suppressing fire down onto enemy positions whilst your infantry are actually debussing from the back and actually taking up position or advancing forward. That was the idea really there. So again, 6 smoke discharges on the side, so you've got those the classic arrangements there on the side of the turret. And for the very early Marder 1s, you're looking at the back there, there's actually a remote machine gun weapon station. So an MG3 machine gun, 7.62, was actually fitted on the side of the turret, and one was fitting on the remote machine gun station at the back there that could be controlled by the crew inside. That was fairly rapidly done away with as being superfluous, didn't really actually have the role that they thought it needed to have. So that goes by the wayside. This vehicle, it can weigh to about 1.5 meters, over 2 meters with a little bit more preparation. So again, they're thinking about how they're going to maneuver across the battlefield. It's got about a 500 kilometer range, so it actually can go quite a bit of a distance. On the cooling system for the vehicle, at the back, air's sucked in on the rear of the decks here, and it's actually vented out as part of the cooling system either side of that rear door that the soldiers actually exit from on the rear of the vehicle. Now, what happens with the Marder is it goes into service with the German military in the 1970s. The worry is that, again, with so many of these vehicles, they need to keep upgrading it because the threat changes and, of course, new technology comes along. And that process leads to a whole series of changes in the Marder vehicles that are in service. So they go back for rebuilds. And just to point out those main changes that go on, what they calls the Marder 1A1, they change the belt feed arrangements on the gun. They give it more a new type of night vision equipment. But they also, what they try and do with this vehicle as well, is they're looking to improve its anti-armour capability. So they add what becomes the Milan anti-tank missile, a guided weapon system. They put 5 in the vehicle, almost one ready to fire by the commander of the vehicle up on the top there, and they lose an infantryman's position in the back as part of doing that. But that means the Marder then has an anti-tank capability carrying that Milan around with it all the time. With the next, the 1A1, we could go through all these different variations, but because there's quite a number of them, some of them are minor improvements, some of them are much more major improvements, and the really big improvement comes with the 1A3 variant. And that is because of this threat they now see from the Soviet BMP-2 vehicle with its 30mm cannon. So the key changes with the A3 variant is they add much more armour on the frontal arc, so it's proof against that 30mm, not just 20mm, and that armour means the gun ports on the side are actually covered over. It also adds new stowage arrangements, slightly different arrangements in the turret configuration, so a number of things actually go on to the point that they actually, before they start that, they make 10 more prototype vehicles showing these upgrades to make sure they're getting all that right. And it's a major rebuild program. Rheinmetall do it. It goes on for about 10 years, where they're doing them in batches to work through just over the 2,000 Marders that are actually in the German Army fleet, upgrading them to this new A3 standard. It's a time that they not only put new armour on, but they do the rearrangement of the hatches on the back. There's then 3 different hatches now for the infantry on the rear. And they do things as well. There's lots of subtle differences. If you look at those vehicles, you can tell the difference there. All of the vehicles obviously in service now were upgraded for the German military and the Bundeswehr to the A3 standard. They do things like a spaced armour roof, so that top attack bomblets would be triggered before hitting the main armour with the infantry in the back. Things like that, again, you can look across. There's quite a range of little variations, or not variations, improvements across the vehicle. And that also, another issue to do with this as well, is weight goes up on the vehicle. So you're now getting a creeping up weight, about 35 tonnes, and some later models were getting into the end of the 30 tonnes as they were adding more things. They're adding more things because, again, in the early 2000s, even though there's a program started, it's been started some time ago, for a replacement vehicle called the Puma. As with so many of these projects, Puma takes longer than expected, so the Marder is still in service with the German Army to this day. From the early 2000s, what they start looking at is how are they going to up the armour protection for one of these vehicles, especially because of mine blast, and then these vehicles are being sent out to Afghanistan. So 2009, for the first time, the Marder is being used in combat with German troops in Afghanistan. And what they're looking at there, if you look at the Marder 1A5 variant, they've again increased the armour protection, especially below, and as with so many vehicles that fought in Iraq and for Afghanistan for the German military, they're doing things, they're trying to add things to it. So you'll see extra stowage, all sorts of things. One of the problems of this vehicle, of course, being originally designed for the North German plain, doesn't have any air conditioning in it. So again, from that point of view, it actually was very, very hot for the German soldiers, but it does perform very well in Afghanistan. Good reports about it, and obviously having 20mm worth of firepower, good mobility, that was a real asset to the German troops who were serving there at the time. Now, they expected to make quite a number of variants on this Marder chassis, but in the end, that doesn't really happen. They're looking at doing things like an ambulance variant, but actually they decide to use the American M113 and make that as an ambulance version. The only real variant that goes into regular service with the German military is they make a version of this as a driver training vehicle with a cab on the top instead of the turret for driver training. So that's in service there. But what does happen is this as a basic vehicle is sold abroad, mainly Argentina. Argentina bases a light tank on this chassis called the TAM. They also do an armoured personnel carrier version, which is simpler really than the original German Marder, and they're built in Argentina itself. And Argentina almost builds some of those variants that the Germans didn't end up going for, like a mortar carrier version, etc. And subsequently, as the German military at the end of the Cold War, as it's downsized over time, some of these vehicles have been sold on. So for example, Chile bought about 200 of them. Jordan's got about 70 now in service. A number went to Indonesia. We've talked about Argentina building their own versions. And my expectations are that more will be sold abroad over time. So we'll be still seeing the Marder in service. And of course, it is still in service with the German military, because the Puma, yes, it's coming into service, but there's still not enough of them yet. The Marder is still a very effective vehicle, so the Germans are still continuing the upgrade programs on Marder. So, for example, even as we speak, there's a program that's been announced to change the night vision sighting equipment there to add, like so many vehicles now, they want cameras to help with visibility, so they're adding a camera on the rear so that the driver can see what's going on. Have the infantry exited? Is it clear behind before you retreat, etc. So those programs are still going on. So the actual size of the fleet in the German military has gone down considerably, but they are still in service. They will still be in service, no doubt, for an awful lot of time longer. And as I mentioned, I think the sales of these will continue. So we'll be seeing them, you know, Indonesia, lots of other countries will be continuing to use these and maybe buying more of them over time.